Hello, and welcome to the KST Healing Hub. I'm Jordania, your hostess. Today, I'm delighted to welcome the extraordinary Rabbi Nancy Tunick, a visionary spiritual and music industry leader, cantorial soloist, composer, writer, and pioneering voice in neurospirituality that include ideas about soul survival and digital detox. So please join me in welcoming Rabbi Nancy Tunick. Welcome, Rabbi Nancy Tunick. It is such an honor to have you here with us. So let's just jump right in.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me.
There is so much happening, and so much of what is happening applies to the work that you do and your interests. And may I ask what initially drew you to some of those interests, specifically in spiritual neuroscience? I mean, how has your background in the music industry influenced your approach to this field?
That predated everything. It predated music industry. It predated my adulthood actually, because my father passed away when I was 7. And I was raised in a Reformed Jewish congregation that was a wonderful congregation with a dynamic and intelligent and incredibly charismatic rabbi who became a dear friend. But at that time, and sometimes during these times, Reformed Judaism has a kind of a gray area about how to deal with what happens when we die, particularly for children. Our language, from a Reform movement standpoint, was centered on memory, like we live on in our memories, which is beautiful. And in Judaism, we focus on that. But when my dad died, my mother, who was amazing and a counseling social worker, like a very educated, a wonderful woman, when I asked where did my father go, she said, well, he lives on in our memories. And I was like, well, that's kind of lame, right? Like as a 7-year-old, I'm like, what does that mean, And so I sort of pushed it, and she responded by saying, well, it's like going to sleep, but you're not really dreaming. And that just sounded terrifying. And at that moment, I felt like I didn't actually feel scared or unhappy about it. I felt sorry for my mom because I felt like, well, of course he's still around. Like we know that. I just want to know where is he? And she clearly doesn't think he's still around. So I literally the next day uh, got balloons. I started this plan to help my mother because, of course, my mother was as devastated or more than everyone. And I thought she doesn't believe he's around, and he is. So I literally took balloons and I forged his name on them. Like I went into his desk. I can picture all this. I'm 7 years old. So obviously this looks ridiculous from an adult standpoint, but I'm thinking I'm going to help my mom. So I plant these balloons like in bushes and things around the neighborhood. And then I go running into the house and I'm like, Mommy, Daddy sent us a message. And so she came out and found like this very poor attempt for me to say that I was in touch with my dad, and then proceeded to take me to therapy, which she did not believe. And I said, no, no, I know it's not true. I was doing it for you. Uh, but, which, she probably took me to therapy for a lot of other great reasons too, because my dad had just died. The end of that story is that from that moment, literally, I thought, I really want to know what this answer is. And so I became really interested in Judaism from a theological standpoint, but mostly I was interested in physics and waves and then the brain, and I was really just examining like what is the science behind this, because we can prove everything else. This was what I thought and was really interested throughout my childhood into my adulthood. Now at the same time, I played piano. My dad was a piano player, and I loved music, and that love for music grew into singing and out of my bat mitzvah and became a cantorial soloist even in my high school years. So the tracks of being interested in neuroscience and physics and quantum theories and music were completely different tracks. Like the intersection would be spirituality has a place in both of them, and so they never really intersected, but they ran parallel in a way that was, effective for my life and continues, to be really effective for my life. And hopefully it helps me carry messages forward. But that's like the strange story of how I got interested. And I have one other little tag to that. It became very focused on neuroscience for another different reason, which was that I have lack in the way that my brain works that I discovered as I became a teenager and into college. And actually, when I met my husband, because he does not have this lack, I call him Magnetic Man. I mean, he became a pilot. He was always oriented. Like he could get you anywhere without looking at a map or a compass. I said he swallowed a compass as a child, which is why I called him Magnetic Man. And so he could do any of these spatial. He had so much situational awareness. He was also a musician and so had a lot of other strengths, but I don't have that at all. Like I am missing that. I have no sense of direction. So much so that I can come out of like my office in my house and look for a landmark. Like I literally cannot find my way anywhere. And when I travel somewhere before GPS, I would literally have like first there was MapQuest and I used to print everything out. And then I'd have to reverse the directions to get back from where I was going. No instinct at all. And no spatial. So I have a really serious problem with like where things are in relation to where I am. So when I drive, I just have to trust the lines. Like it feels like everybody's on top of me, like that they're merging on me, but I have to trust my visual. So at some point, because I understand things quickly, I read, like I have some intellectual strengths, and this was a dramatic weakness, and it shows up in tests, like when you do like an IQ test and they do these like the plane is this way and they're like which one matches the other one, right? I have no idea. Like the only way I can solve those is if I do intellectual cues, like oh here's a straight line, and like I can deduce it, but I don't actually have any gut for it. So I'm like, what part of my brain doesn't work? And it was just almost like a funny thing that I was like, well, I know a lot about the brain, so I'm going to figure out what is my problem, right? And what I discovered was that my right parietal is not functioning really highly. And so as I started to study that, I found the connection between the right parietal and spirituality, which is what most of my research is focused on. So it's sort of an interesting confluence of interests and events that led me to what most of my research has been for the last 15 years.
Sounds like you were being guided on a very
Indeed.
distinct path.
Exactly, which is part of what I teach and talk about when I talk about overcoming digital fatigue and neurospirituality is the idea of noticing signs and synchronicities that like that the universe does tell you things, and so if you are open to them, you end up further along than if you are not.
Digital detox is so important, and I do want to touch on that. But first, what is your definition of neurospirituality so that we can learn what are we trying to detox from?
Sure, absolutely. And it's interesting. When I first started studying the right parietal and I started to focus primarily on the brain and spirituality rather than some other science, I found the work of a doctor named Dr. Andrew Newberg, and he had done brain scans and was studying the relationship between those brain scans and some really interesting people. Like he brain scanned Brazilian automatic writers, like mediums. He brain scanned people in deep religious practice. So he brain scanned Buddhist monks who had meditated for decades. He brain scanned Catholic nuns who had had these deep rosary practices, and found a lot of really interesting things. And I read a lot of his early work, and he deemed that neurotheology, and that work supported my hypothesis, but also had some additional things. He never stayed very focused on this one part of the brain, but it is part of it that other scientists have since studied. I always thought that neurotheology, I mean, not to argue with Dr. Andrew Newberg, who is amazing, but I really felt like it was not neurotheology, because theology to me involves study in a way that actually takes you out of this space, because it involves order, it involves other parts of the brain that may be counter to this. So I always felt like what he was talking about was spirituality, because he was also including people who had spiritual practices rather than religious practices. Interestingly, he is Jewish, and he wrote a book about rabbis' brains, which is a really interesting book that you might be interested in. I can't remember the name of it, but it would be easy to find. It has rabbi in the title. Continues to be more focused on religious practice. And so I coined the word neurospirituality because I just felt like the idea of how the brain informs your spiritual practice and how spirituality informs your brain's response was really the center of my interest. Interestingly, a few years ago, Harvard started a neurospiritual lab. And so a PhD named Michael Ferguson, who has a really interesting background and coincidentally is also a musician and a professor, came out of a Mormon background and is now Catholic, has initiated this and has been running this lab that is studying the brain and spirituality, which is really exciting. So now it's becoming a little bit more of a zeitgeist, like that people are talking about it and can contribute because there's a lot about neurospirituality that we can delve into. I've been pretty narrow in my focus because I felt like what I was studying was really the core of it all, and I still do. But it's exciting to have so much science that reinforces it and so much research.
Oh my gosh, it really, really is a lot to be said for faith,
Indeed.
but the research gives us that base.
It
So
does.
it
Yeah.
really, really does.
Just that gap between faith and knowing is really important when we talk about, in particular, about mysteries, like the mysteries of the world, like who we are, what happens when we die is such a core mystery. And I think that's why people come back to it being sort of a religious reference, like neurotheology, is because that's what a lot of religion answers, right? Like great mysteries, or tries to, right? Or attempts to provide security and comfort surrounding it. So the idea of what happens when we die comes back to why I started all of this research. Like I literally, for my entire life since I was 7 years old, have been on this quest to solve death. I always said solve death. And I never, like, I don't love the phrase entirely because I'm not trying to say we should live forever, which sometimes that's what it sounds like immortality. I'm saying solve the mystery of death because the mystery of death, we frame it in a way that can feel positive. In Judaism, we say, like, in the urgency of time we create is a lovely prayer that we do before the Kaddish and a Reform Siddur. Like the idea that we're here and we're challenged to make the most of it, and that we don't operate well as humans without a deadline is legitimate, and I like that framing. But I also feel like the unknown psychologically and neurologically is always linked to fear. So that when you don't know what's going to happen next, it doesn't matter what it is. There's like some level of anxiety. It's not a positive emotion typically, unless you are not neurotypical. My husband also, who flew F-18s and landed on carriers at night, actually really liked to be like, he liked the feeling of danger, like I don't know that he actually felt fear about anything almost. But most people who are neurotypical, when they don't know what's going to happen, whether it's like I have a meeting and I'm not sure who those people are and what I'm going to say at the meeting, or I have to speak in front of people, or I'm going on an airplane to another country and I've never done that, right? All of those things have these unknowns associated and they create a little anxiety or a lot depending on what it is. So from my perspective, death is like the great unknown, and that it then provides a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear for people if they focus on it. Neurologically, our brains don't let us focus on it too heavily. It's really interesting. If you focus on other people's deaths, your brain allows you to do it. But scientists, researchers have brain scanned people, and when you focus on your own, your brain distracts you. It's a really interesting response, mostly so that we can continue to be biologically and neurologically stable, right? Like that if we are derailed, we won't then feed ourselves and clothe ourselves and house ourselves, right? So a lot of this is your body allowing you to be human. But if, from my perspective, if we solved the mystery of death, rather than just becoming, I don't know, lazy and so complacent, it would eliminate this fear and anxiety that I think possibly could make us more productive. Like that fear and anxiety in many ways can stop us from contributing at the highest level that we possibly could, because we're trying to just feel as secure as we can because there's this underlying uncertainty. And so that's why I've pursued that idea. And faith, the majority of people in the United States believe that there's something after we die. They have the faith of that, and the numbers range anywhere from 72% to 88%. Like this large majority of people, regardless of their spiritual or religious background, say that they have faith that there is soul survival. The gap is do you know it, right? And I always make this comparison. Like when somebody dies, we who believe that they're still around in a really strong way. I've done a tremendous amount of study and feel like I probably have enough evidence to say I have scientifically proven it, but I still feel like it resides in belief. And it's different than if my loved one dies and they're not around anymore, I have the belief that they are around. But if my loved one packed a bag back in the day when the New World was starting and got on a ship and sailed to the New World, you would grieve the fact that you weren't going to see them, right? You weren't going to talk on the phone because there were no phones, and you weren't going to get a letter because there was no way to do that. But you knew they existed. Like they're in the New World, right? I mean, I'm predicting that. My husband, being an F-18 pilot, would leave for long periods of time when we were young. So he would leave for 9 months at a time, and back then we actually didn't have email and text, and nowadays it's so much easier. So there were large gaps of communication. We would actually write each other letters, which are precious now. And so, but I knew he existed, right? I missed him. I hated that he was away. He got out of the Navy because he hated being away. And so like there was a physical missing. You were sad that he wasn't there, but it wasn't the same level of grief as when somebody's dead, because that you don't have this possibility that it's annihilation. And so that's sort of the gap, in my opinion, between belief and knowing, and that the knowing could really be meaningful if it were accepted. And I believe, I love that verb, I believe that we may have enough evidence to take it to knowing. It's just not welcomed in most scientific communities. So it makes it challenging for the general public to even understand that there is a preponderance of evidence in the same way that there is for other proofs that we have in science to say that we've solved it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many things that you touched on. And one, the love that you and your husband shared and share is just, my heart just expands at the thought of it.
And I miss him physically,
Yeah.
and because he passed away almost 5 years ago. And so, and the world again sort of works in these very bizarre ways, right? I've spent most of my rabbinic career focused on grief and soul survival. I mean, I'm a congregational rabbi, so obviously I do everything, but I really have become the person who, because of this study and because of my interest in it, that I spent a lot of time looking even at what Judaism says about death and what happens afterwards and soul survival. And so my husband and I spent years talking about all of this because we were intellectual partners and loved to just talk about our work. And so for him to pass away early and suddenly, certainly those discussions allowed us to fulfill his wishes, because we talked about all of that at great length, because we talked about death a lot. But also, it was very, it was resonant in so many ways, because we delayed having children because of just my emotional response to losing a parent when I was young. So to then have my children were teenagers then when my husband passed away, they were 14 and 15. And so that was devastating, and a lot about it was devastating. But on the other side of it, clearly he's around. And so I miss him, but it definitely for me feels like New World rather than annihilation.
We say clearly. At the start, you mentioned he had an incredible spatial relationship that you don't. So, do you have a kinesthetic awareness of him continuing, of his presence in your life?
I think his awareness actually was counter to what I studied. And it's funny, I'll tell a quick story before the answer to that. I did a research study a number of years ago that still lives online, and I could probably share the link if you were interested, that studied the differences between our spatial ability and our spiritual ability. And so a lot of science is out there regarding the right parietal and spatial that supports the idea that if you have damage to your right parietal, if you have a stroke there, or you are born with damage there, that or a lack of function rather than damage, that your spirituality is higher, like your levels of spirituality. There's a negative relationship between the two of them. That is what I found in the research, which is so interesting. And some of it can be, explained. There are two different theories. Like one theory is that your boundaries, like the idea that I'm sitting in a chair and there's a desk in front of me and that there are things around me, keep me separated from others, right? Like that it creates walls. And so your right parietal provides the boundaries that you need in order to function, right? I need to be able to know where the chair is. I need to be able to drive in the lane. Like I can't just be connected to everything and be a human. Like humans rely on boundaries from a biological and neurological standpoint. When you remove those or you lessen them, which is what meditation does and what all of these practices do, it reduces the activity in your right parietal. You feel at one with the universe. It removes your boundaries. You feel connected to everything. And so it's shown in research with people who have damage, like if you have a stroke in your right parietal, in some cases, people can't tell the difference between their hand and the chair. Like that they don't know where the chair starts. Like that you can have those kinds of really dramatic reductions in function. But then most of those people have these higher levels of feeling connected to the universe. So you could say it's because your boundaries are released, so it creates the perception of being connected to the universe. But I'm a rabbi and have a really strong faith system and have some evidence that maybe turns it around in the other way, which is that we are connected to the universe and that our right parietals create false boundaries so that we can be humans. And when we reduce that, we're sort of, opening the window to what is beyond. So those are the two answers to that negative relationship. And the reason I bring that up is because I tested about 120 people, and what I have is this test where you do a spatial awareness test, which is one of those like here's the triangle and here are the lines, and then we do a spiritual personality inventory test, Cloninger's kind of standard spiritual personality inventory test, and then I scored them based on each other, right? Like the comparison, and it was a very distinct negative relationship. But it was, of course, like a curve. And so some people had no spatial or no spiritual, but two people out of my 120 had really high spatial and really high spiritual. And my husband was one of them. And so, which was funny because that was a big difference between us. I proved the point with my extremely low spatial and my high spiritual. So in answer to your question, I'm not sure that it's related to the idea of his spatial ability as much as it is related to that he just was excellent at everything, right? Like he flew F-18s and then went to Top Gun and like he was like the best. And then he wanted to be a country musician and ended up playing the Grand Ole Opry and being nominated for an ACM award, right? Like he didn't engage in things halfway, and he engaged in everything that he wanted to engage in. So I think the reason that we feel him all around us may be just because he's really good at making sure that we know that he's all around us. I'm always like, yes, you're so good. So that's my explanation of, just the awareness, not only just that we know he's around, but some wonderful signs that my family is aware of because of how our mindset is, how we frame things.
That is wonderful. Yeah, he is still around so strongly. I'm glad he's made that very apparent. And what's wonderful too is we don't have to have our temporal lobes damaged to experience that oneness if it doesn't come naturally. All we have to do is live. Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, after 50, our temporal lobes begin to atrophy. So
it's actually the right parietal. So
yes.
So that is very true, right? Like from a right parietal standpoint, that is also like a functional bell curve, which is really interesting. So, and this is so fascinating and speaks to my first story. When your right parietal basically comes online when you're about 7 years old. So prior to that age, you have very poor spatial. And who are the people who are talking to God or dead grandmom in the bedroom or imaginary friends and have this like flow of creativity and imagination, right? It's children. And when they get to a certain age, scientists and psychologists explain this by saying, oh, well, they become part of the world, right? So now they're at school and they're being influenced by their peers, and so all of that starts to get constrained. I actually believe it's neurological. Their right parietal comes online and their window gets shut, right? Like it's open, they're flowing, I'm talking to God. And now suddenly your right parietal's online and you have spatial and these things that you need in order to function as a human, and that reduces. And a really interesting study at the University of Virginia. For decades, they have been studying past lives. So there's a doctor there, Ian Stevenson, who started this study, studied thousands of kids, mostly in Eastern cultures because they were open to that idea. But then Jim Tucker took it over and started studying Western examples. These kids remember their past lives, and so they'll be very young and be talking about another village or another city or another life and people and details. And the University of Virginia studied them, went there and went on location, would investigate how accurate it was. It's an amazing amount of evidence of reality. But the interesting thing to me was that when they turn about 7 or 8 years old, they stop remembering things. They remember their memories, but they don't have new ones. So they stop saying like, oh, wait, my sister did this and I lived in this house over by they remember the things they said, but then they don't have new memories. And that was explained by the University of Virginia by the idea, again, that when they talk about it and peers, say, oh, no, that's silly. But that doesn't really even apply from an Eastern culture where they reinforce it. And what I realized and would love to study further is that that's when your right parietal comes online. So if your right parietal is blocking you from those memories neurologically, that's why it would stop at that age. And I did reach out to Dr. Tucker about that, and said a number of years ago, actually, right when COVID started, and said, hey, wouldn't it be great to have you thought about this? And he came back and said, actually, I haven't, which was fun because I'm just a rabbi in Nashville. I'm a citizen scientist, right? I don't have a PhD in neuroscience, which I wish I did. And so he was saying that makes a lot of sense. So he has since retired. I may circle back around to the idea of trying to get funding to brain scan kids with past lives memories to see if when their right parietal comes online actually times with when those new memories stop, because that is just further evidence. So that also happens in the other end of our lives. Like our right parietal function starts to decrease as we get older. And so you will see studies that show children are more spiritual and older people are more spiritual. And that neurological connection is really interesting because, I feel like it's part of this orientation area, the right parietal, which not only controls spatial, but also impacts your time management, which I have none of those also. Like, I can blame it on Jewish time because we have Jewish time. Even this morning, I had some conflict come up and I was a little late for us. But that's kind of typical, sadly, because I really measure time poorly also. And that's part of the same brain network. And your ego's involved in that. So like your own awareness of yourself, because all of this is about how you're oriented in space and time. And in spirituality and in religion, time and space are not really part of what lies beyond us. So this area, which the right parietal is part of the default mode network, which is a new name for a network of interrelationship in the brain that's really come up in the last 15 or 20 years. It's been named this default mode network that controls that. So when we are thinking about us in the world, our spatial placement, our orientation, and in time, it becomes self-focused, which is actually also counter to spirituality, right? Like when we move ourselves out of the way, one of the greatest ways to be spiritual is to do something for somebody else, right? Like to be connected in that way and to have it be about others. And so that is also a brain function.
That is. So you and your husband came to the same conclusions, just from different perspectives. You have the full
Yes.
gamut between you.
Yeah,
It is.
absolutely. I think he had an intellectual appreciation of it and had a really strong belief in everything, but was still really grounded in the physical, more than I am. Like I really, my daughter's a lot like my husband, and now she's 21 and does the same things to me. Like when we're walking through New York City, she's always like, "Mom, the light pole, the street." Like I sort of move through the world situationally unaware, and he was very aware, but still had this really high connection to what was beyond that also. So a little jealous of not always being at risk of being hit by a car.
But that gives so much more validity to this work as well, because
Indeed, yeah.
you can approach it from so many different angles. You mentioned the Jewish faith, what are the beliefs around it about soul survival?
That's a great question. And so I actually I have a children's book coming out this year about what happens when you die. I have worked on for many, many years and is finally being published, which I'm really excited about. And because Judaism struggles with what we tell people, like my original story, like the idea of Reform Judaism saying, well, they live on in our memories, still exists. Like recently, I walked into a different synagogue than mine and picked up a pamphlet that the Reform Union, had published that talked about what happens when we die, which is progress that we're even talking about it. But in it had this sort of idea that everything is right, whatever you believe is accurate, and that some people, that Judaism often reinforces the idea that we live on in our memories. So Judaism focuses, the more progressive movements focus on memory and on living our lives as they did in their finest moments, which is all beautiful language. I have no problem with that idea at all, obviously. But it ignores what we actually say in liturgy. So we say in the Torah many times that we are gathered unto our people in between when we die and when we're buried. The SFL Amav, like that is what we say. That's what happened to Moses and to Aaron and to Miriam and to everyone, was we die, we're gathered unto our people, and then we're buried. And so that's sort of the first reference to the idea that there's something beyond this, like that our people are waiting for us beyond. We have a lot of conflicting ideas that are written, but they're all there explaining something. And so we don't take any of what is written necessarily literally. As a Jewish religion, mostly we're commentary based, right? And so a lot of it is interpretation. But we have stories like the Witch of Endor, where you're not supposed to go to a medium, but when Saul and Samuel had an incredible conversation that transcended the physical to the spiritual, that exists in our writing. So if there's no soul survival, I'm not exactly sure what was happening there. And those stories exist, and we don't focus on them. When Joseph is kidnapped and led away, he's chatting with his dead mom on the side of the road, right? And so those things exist, but meanwhile, progressive and more modern Judaism wrote them out, basically, so that we, felt maybe, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I feel like Reform Judaism in particular, like in the 1800s and from like German Reform on, really felt like that was too woo-woo, like that we have very practical people who are practicing this religion and they're doing social justice and they're doing good, which is all amazing. But all of this, like, hey, I'm talking to my dead mom as they're leading me away and she's saying it's going to be all right, doesn't fit in with what we're extracting as interpretation. And then, of course, Kabbalah and Zohar, like as Judaism progressed, then all of this beautiful mystical language arose in the 14th century that a lot of the more progressive religions borrow the language, right? Like in our prayer books, we have these lovely interpretations of prayers that aren't literal. They're completely borrowed from Zohar. Like we mention angels and we talk, and of course angels show up in the Torah too. We have all of this spiritual language, but somehow we manage to say that that doesn't apply to us when we transcend, unless we focus on it. So the Orthodox do actually support that mystical and spiritual language, and that's what's really beautiful about Orthodoxy. It has its own struggles with reality and women and a lot of other, fundamental beliefs that are interesting and challenging, as does every religion have its strengths and its challenges. But when, I don't know if you remember, Jordania, you and I went through similar training that we had like a segment on pastoral care regarding what happens when you die. And I remember, I think it was in a book we were reading, that it actually said, as a Jewish caregiver, that when somebody is dying and they say, what happens when you die, that you should ask them, what do they believe? And then whatever they say, you can say, Judaism supports that. And I thought that was funny and actually a little dismaying, because that's a challenging way to frame any kind of ideas about soul survival, because of how big the mystery is. So I'll circle back to what my interpretation of Judaism, if it were boiled down, Judaism says that we go somewhere else, that there is soul survival, that there is heaven. We have heaven too, and that there is no hell. Like the idea of Satan is considered evil. Like ha Satan is a Hebrew word for the evil, and so that's typically looked at more like the human activity of evil, not a spiritual force, right? So we have heaven. That's very challenging for Jewish belief because that just says everybody goes to heaven basically. And so then you have to ask the question about people who behaved in an evil way on this earth. And does that mean I actually have to like share heaven with, I hate to say it, but do I have to share heaven with Hitler, right? Like everyone goes back to this idea. But what Judaism really does teach that intersects with neurospirituality is the idea that evil is a human construct. Like it's a psychological, like a lot of it has to do with mental illness. It has to do with the way our brains work and how they process. It's chemical, hormonal, and it's physical. And that spiritual doesn't have that. So when you are no longer constrained by your brain and by your body and by your nerves and by what your body says is threatening you, that suddenly you are completely spiritual. You're good. Like, and that's sort of the difference between when we say like you can choose life and good or death and evil in Judaism. Well, life and good just is the spiritual side of us, and the death and evil is like the physical side, and we strive to balance both. So I wrote a book that's called Eli Goes to Heaven that talks about how a child is born and it places him in a Jewish setting in a farm, and he has children and then grandchildren, and he teaches them what he learned, and then he peacefully dies, and he is greeted by everyone who has gone to heaven before him. He's gathered unto his people, and then from there he watches over his children, his grandchildren, the pride of his life, until one grandchild has another child who they name Eli, and he lives on a farm, and it sort of circles back around again into like a cycle of life, because we teach that there is something beyond us. There is actually an opportunity for intersection between those worlds. We have language that proves that from a Jewish standpoint, and that we are watched over. We definitely have language of reviewing our lives in Jewish writing, like this idea of God will show you the videotape. I used to say back when there were videotapes, right? Like not as like a punishment, but as a an education and an opportunity for soul progression, and that we watch over and that the cycle begins again. There is even support for reincarnation. We call it Gilgul, and that is this idea of coming back again. So I wrote the book because I really strongly believe that children need a foundation of belief, like that from our neurological development, if we're told a story that has both theological and scientific and spiritual support, that it's so much easier to navigate that mystery. It doesn't stop you from taking action in this world, because that's why Judaism shies away from stories of what happens when we die, is because we're not a reward culture. So like Christianity, where you have language that says like if you're good you go to heaven, if you're bad you go to hell, and so there's this sort of idea of we're going to be punished. Judaism, death is not a punishment, and so that idea, for some people, I think that our sages, many of them believed that if we did not have that threat, why would we then act good, and that we would have to really focus on what we do in our human lives in order to get people to do the things that we're supposed to do as Jews and as members of a human community. So the book, to me, allows children to grow up spiritually within a Jewish framework and have that belief, because I think the majority of people our age who were raised in at least Reform and probably conservative Judaism, most of them, when I talk to them, don't even know that we believe that there's soul survival, like don't even know that we think that there's a heaven. And many of them feel very disconnected to Judaism, like they consider themselves cultural Jews rather than spiritual ones, because that great mystery was never addressed in a way that was comforting and secure, but also grounded in our writings and in science. So that's a very long answer to your very short question.
I
I
love it.
specialize in that, by the way.
I love it. I love this information. It is phenomenal. Um, Oh, did I just lose the thought? There were so many thoughts. I'm like, I want to
I'm
ask her this. I
sorry.
want to ask her this. I want to ask her this. Oh, well, one thing, you were talking about how, oh, I know.
It's back.
I'm back. No, um, Judaism tends not to focus on these mysteries that do exist in it if we dig, because we're not supposed to focus on, we're here to have a life. So, like I said,
Exactly.
between 7 and 50, we're supposed to be biologically the most productive. We're supposed to be focused on the world. It takes enough to focus on the day to day to get through it, to learn from it, and thus the mitzvot. Um, in the 13th century, 11th, yes, all this did seem to go underground and then pop back up with Kabbalah and the Zohar 13th, Arizal 16th. But before that, I mean, we have in the ancient systems, in the ancient temples, there's the zodiac on
Right.
our floors.
Absolutely.
There are trade routes between Mesopotamia and the East. They even found yogic asanas on certain Jewish homes in Mesopotamia. So I think it existed. It just
Oh,
started to,
absolutely.
during the canonization process, some of the more conservatives kind of
Yeah.
took in the fold, and now things are maybe opening up again a little
I
bit.
would love to I would love to see that. I mean, and that which is again why I wrote the book when my grandfather died. In what year did he die? In 1990. What was that? Nine? No, no, it was in 2006. My gosh, I have no sense of time. Neurologically. So in no 2008. My goodness, my grandfather died in 2008. My children were toddlers, and they knew my grandparents were 96. Both my grandparents died that year, but my grandfather died first, and he was 96 years old. My toddlers knew my grandparents. We were close, and they lived in Philadelphia, but we would go home pretty often. I live in Nashville. So on the plane, my husband and I did not bring my kids, but on the plane to the funeral, I wrote the text of Eli Goes to Heaven. My grandfather's name was Eli. Because I wanted to be able to explain it to my kids. Like, so I wrote this sort of rhymey thing when Eli was little. He lived on a farm. He loved to play in the loft of the barn. Like, I did this whole thing on the plane. And it was strictly because I wanted to be able to give them an answer that was more concrete, even at the age of, 3 and 2, to be able to have that belief. So I read them that story and they loved it and responded to it. And actually, the very first book, I asked my daughter to illustrate it like with a crayon. And so I put together paper with the writing and her illustrations and hole punched it, and we tied ribbons in it and made a book of Eli Goes to Heaven for them to use. And honestly, I became very motivated about it. I've used that text often because I actually feel like at the end of it, I have a note to parents, and I take every part of the story and say, this is where it's documented in Torah or in Talmud. Like, I give everybody like footnotes on what the support of it is. And I have found over the years that when I even just use the text, that adults really respond because they don't know the answer. So they're like, oh, great, like a story I can tell my kids, or even a story I can tell myself. But when my husband died and my kids were, 14 or 15, 10 years later, I felt like their response to it was influenced by Eli Goes to Heaven. Like, they had a very core belief about what all of this meant, and it helped them. And so that I became much more focused on the idea of having it published in the world because of that. Because I actually feel like there are some wonderful books out there for adults that I just don't think enough people have read. Like there a rabbi in California, gosh, and I'll have to. You may know the book that is about soul survival. That he took a sabbatical and wrote about what Judaism says, and some really personal experiences from him. I'll have to get you that if you want to share it. It's a great book. And then there are other rabbis who have done deep dives into Judaism and soul survival. But I do feel like we live in I hate to say this, but we live in a headline world, right? And neurologically, our attention span is quite reduced because of the world, right? Like we look at everything as like a TikTok. So very few people are on social media. Everything needs to be, 30 seconds or a minute, or we start to wander. And we're just training our brains to do that more and more because that's what neuroplasticity is about, trains, your neural pathways. So sadly, we're reducing our ability to dive in deep. And when you're busy and Judaism is just part of what you do, it's your tradition or your culture or what you do on a Friday night. It's not like you're going to do a deep intellectual study on what Judaism says if it's not presented to you. And so I actually feel like an illustrated children's book is a good way for adults to also learn about this. And I'd like to be able to change the conversation a little bit in the more progressive movements so that people feel more spiritually connected to a really beautiful religious practice that may have left out some of that spirituality along the way.
Yeah, no, Eli Goes to Heaven should be required reading for children and adults alike, because although Judaism does emphasize focusing on the living and our life, it's not because the other isn't important. And maybe, like you spoke about that lady earlier, it would really help for people to know that, yes, it is covered. And per your research, there is definitive proof.
Right. And the idea, like I think about our lives, like when you start your day, if you're feeling anxious, are you more or less productive? Like if you wake up and you're feeling great and comfortable and wonderful, I'm more productive when I feel good. And so, or when I don't have anxiety or fear. And I think this sort of underlying current of uncertainty, if we reduced that with language and with study, that we would be more productive, that we may find that. Now I don't know, I'm predicting that. I mean, there could be all sorts of other responses to it, and I know there have been many thought experiments about what would we do if we had definitive proof of what happens when we die. There are movies about it, like would we be more productive or would we not, like what would it do to a lot of things. It's a pretty weighty subject. Like I don't mean to make light of it. There's the idea that would we give up easily, and would there be an increase in suicide, or would there be like there could be some repercussions because everything has very intricate kinds of responses. But at the very least, I don't think there's anything in any in any Jewish religious writing or practice that says that we should not be examining things and that we should not be embracing new information, or that we should not be trying to incorporate it in a way that allows us to help to repair the world, which is really the center point of Judaism, like tikkun olam, and what we do, in our daily lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned the stress. And one thing, our body tends not to know the difference between good and bad stress. So how do we use it? And you mentioned your husband utilizing it in a way where there's no fear. He could fly a plane
Right.
at night,
Yeah.
right? So,
I love that connection, actually, right? Yeah, his lack of fear, he accomplished a lot. He was Mr. I'm accomplishment. So, and not for the sake of that, it just was because that's how he moved through the world.
yeah. And a lot of your work addresses overcoming the stress, this digital fatigue, uh,
Yes.
as you describe it sometimes in certain areas through these neurospiritual practices. So, what are some key strategies that you've developed or
Yeah.
recommend?
So that's, it's interesting. I had this research, and I had been talking about the research at some length for many years, and spoke to groups about neurospirituality just in the way that we've been talking about it. But I started to crystallize it a little bit because I was being asked to speak to groups like corporate groups or to in colleges, and the question that I was asked by a speakers group was, what problem are you solving? Like, so we can say, like, I mean, and so maybe one problem is that the fear of death, but that felt a little bit weighty for the Rotary, and so, like, what problem was I solving with neurospirituality? And when I looked at the world, I thought, well, actually what we're solving with neurospiritual practices is digital fatigue. Because when I talk about connecting beyond the internet, I'm talking about the idea that we are actually restricting, we're doing the opposite with our neurological process when we spend too much time with input from screens like that. And that a lot of what we're seeing in the world, I believe, is neurological. Like this separation that we're seeing where everybody feels different than the other person and we demonize each other and we're, polarized about things. I mean, it's dramatic, right? Like this is different than when we were growing up. It really is. I mean, there were terrible problems when we were growing up that may have been resolved since then from a social and cultural standpoint. But the idea that we can be so mean to each other and that we can feel so separate from each other is really a neurological response, in my opinion, based on this research. And a lot of it has to do with not just social media because it allows us to say things anonymously. Like, certainly there is a case for the idea that social media is almost like road rage, right? Like that you can scream and curse at somebody from the safety of your car because you wouldn't scream and curse at somebody in person. But now we would because we did it enough online. But I would also propose the idea that when you are using screens and when you're researching, you're increasing your right parietal. And there's nothing wrong with some of that. Like we obviously need it. Like the reason we have this part of the brain or any part of the brain is so that we can survive. Like they're survival mechanisms, right? So we do need to feel some separation or else we would probably be killed by a predator. And so we need to know like, oh, hey, danger. Oh, there's a border here. But when we keep flooding our brains with both like audio, visual, it's triggering other parts of our brains. Like everything is functioning and it's processing through the right parietal, which is highly active, and we're feeling more separate, less connected. So I noticed like neurospiritual practices are based on meditation to begin with, right? Like Buddhist monks meditate. Lots of people meditate now. Like it's become something that's like a practice. And when you brain scan people who are meditating, their right parietal is reducing. It's the primary function, actually, is that you feel connected to everything because by focusing on either a chant or breathing, you are increasing your prefrontal cortex, which is like semi-automatic behavior, and that reduces your right parietal. Everything in your brain tends to balance out. When you increase something here, something else decreases there. Like it's not like everything can go. So that prefrontal cortex increase reduces right parietal, and that's what meditation does. And then in return, you feel connected and at peace. And so that happens in rituals, like when when we say the same words over and over again. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Like I just said a foundational prayer in Hebrew quickly because I don't have to think about saying those words. Like I say those words every single day. And if you do that, it becomes a meditation because you don't need active thinking. I don't have to think, oh, what comes after Shema? It's Yisrael, right? Like I don't have to engage my brain. And so that's what like almost like a mantra is, this idea that if you say in other religions too, like I like the Lord's Prayer in Christianity, like you get into a room and somebody starts to say the Lord's Prayer, most everyone who's Christian immediately just goes into it. They know all the words and they can do the whole thing without thinking about it. Well, it makes you feel connected because by saying words you reduce your right parietal. That's true of other ritualistic practices. When you move your body in an unusual way, interestingly, it reduces your right parietal. So if I like lift my arms in the air right now, it reduces my right parietal. So when we like dip our knees and bow, those things like when in Christianity, when you get down and you kneel, or in Judaism, when you stand and you sit, those things are all neurological, and they create this feeling, or they allow you to connect to the universe, right? To be connected. So in a setting that was not religious, I came up with this framework called CONNECT, because connection is really the core of everything. So, and I love an acronym. My husband was in the Navy, like everything was an acronym. So CONNECT spells something. So C means to control screen time. So the research shows don't wake up in the morning and look at your phone, and don't look at your phone before you go to bed. Like those are key times neurologically when you should not be looking at a screen. Have times when you are not online, like where you're not looking things up. Let your brain be able to engage in ways that aren't just occipital and auditory through a screen. So controlling screen time, turning off notifications so that you're not constantly pinged out of your meditative or connected feeling. Like that's the issue with screens and with all of our platforms, is that they infringe on our space and our time, and they take us out. So control screen time. O means to do one thing at a time. There's actually no such thing as multitasking neurologically. It's just very fast sequential tasking, right? You really actually can't do more than one thing at a time. It's just that your brain goes like bing, 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 and it gives us the perception that we're doing it. So if you actually do one thing at a time, you are going to have more productivity, more creativity, more connection in a way that's like more spiritual. Neurospiritual practices, which is my first N, are these little practices that we do anyway. When we shower, we are reducing our right parietal, because nobody says, okay, now I'm going to wash under my arms, right? Like when you shower, you have a routine that's like ritualistic, and you don't think about it. So it's light attention meditation is what I call it. When you do something so often that your brain has light attention to it, because if you had no attention to it, you would not wash your hair, right? And occasionally, as I get older, I'm like, did I condition? But mostly we don't think that, right? We just do it. So interestingly, when we do that routine in the shower, our right parietal reduces. And when do we get great ideas? In the shower. And so the other time we get great ideas is while we're driving, in traffic in particular. Same thing, light attention. We don't actually think, that car stopping, I'm putting my foot on the brake, I'm turning the wheel. Like our brain is not constantly aggressively making decisions about what we do when we drive. We've driven so much, if we're drivers. I mean, if you're in the city and you don't drive, then maybe your brain is active. But if most of us, when we drive, particularly in traffic, we're in light attention meditation. Our right parietal is reducing, as long as you're not listening to the radio or listening to music. Because then that takes you out of that, because it's making your right parietal, other than orientation, also processes your senses. So like when you hear or see something, you use a different part of the brain, like occipital, but then it sends it to your right parietal, who then says, this is how I make sense of it in the world. So when you have those inputs, your right parietal gets engaged, takes you out of that spiritual, connected, creative world. And as a faith-based and a spiritual leader, I look at those ideas that we get when we're in the shower or we're driving in traffic, not just like, hey, somehow my brain is more creative. I think they're coming from beyond us, like that they're coming from the universe. Like we are not completely responsible for them. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of that too. I own a music business company, and I do write. I compose, I write songs, I write books. And that when you talk to songwriters in particular, when they write their biggest hits and they say like, what was the process? Most of them will say, oh, this one, like I didn't work on this at all. It came to me in like 20 minutes, almost like it flowed right through me. And I'm like, almost like, what a coincidence. Maybe it did. So those light attention meditation practices are what I call neurospiritual practices. So that, and those can be doodling. I do a whole lot of in meetings. I do a whole lot of just like drawing circles and lines. I'm not thinking about it, but it absolutely reduces my right parietal. I do it. I didn't used to do it on purpose. I would just have a paper and pencil to take notes, and I'd look down and I'd have this folk art masterpiece. Not really, not a masterpiece. I'm not actually a good artist, but I would be doing this, and it would reduce my right parietal and create ideas. I like to have meetings on the phone without like hands free while I'm driving in traffic, because I get good ideas while I'm doing it in a meeting, like when I'm in a creative business setting. And I feel like a lot of these neurospiritual practices have helped my business. Like I've had business success because I allow my brain to come up with ideas that are not typical. So that's the neurospiritual practices. That's true with any fidget. Like there's all sorts of ways to do it. And meditation, like actual literal meditation is a way to reduce, is a neurospiritual practice. But these are ways. Don't listen to music. Don't watch something while you're doing routines, and you'll find that you have not only more ideas but more peace. Quickly, the second N is to notice synchronicities, notice coincidences, like notice signs, like that's the N. That if you alert yourself to the world giving you direction, that it will give you direction even more, because it's always there. You just have to, it's like one of those fun puzzles where you have like find the little things hidden and everything. Like the signs are there, and as soon as you start to see those things, you see them more, and they increase. I call them like Hineni, like here I am, right? Like the word from God is like, here I am. You go, oh, look, I saw a sign. And then you answer back, Hanani, here I am. I'm going to respond to it and take the road. So that's the second N of connect. E means to elevate your purpose. So for neurospirituality, it's like find the meaning behind the action, whatever it is. Like if you're a cashier, the elevated purpose would be that you brighten a person's day as you're, making change, right? Like if you're anything that you do, there can be an elevated purpose. And for your work, it's incredibly important. Whatever your work is doing, it interacts with people in a way that creates a really beautiful whole. So if you can find what purpose you have, like I'm in the music business, other than being a neuroscience researcher and a rabbi. And in the music business, like I have an elevated purpose. Music is incredibly meaningful to people. And so whatever part of that I serve, whether I'm bringing a wonderful song from somebody else to people through radio promotion or through managing of another artist, that's my elevated purpose. So we're spelling connect. We're back to another C, which is collaborate. The idea that when you engage other people in your work or in your life, you are again reducing boundaries. Like by collaborating, you're enforcing connection, right? Like you are actually saying, hey, I'm going to step beyond the wall that I built around me, and I'm going to bring in other ideas. The more you collaborate, the broader you are and the more spiritual and more creative and productive you become. And then the T is transcend your boundaries almost purposefully, right? Like we know what keeps us in, and if we say, I'm stepping beyond that, right? Like that makes me uncomfortable. Oh, I'm going to go do it, right? Like seek discomfort, lean into that, like transcend the boundaries that you create, color outside of those lines, and you will, like find again this idea that it's going to, in many ways, trick your brain into putting you in a space that allows you to not only go beyond the boundaries of your physical life, but beyond the boundaries into the universe. That's my framework. It's connect.
Connect.
Done quickly.
I love that. Connect. I will never think of
Connect.
that word again in the same way. I love it. Wow. It reminded me of as above, so below, as below, so above.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. I
so
love it.
in this case, Yetzirah, the same as the Sia, the same as Yetzirah. Yeah, the reflection of.
Yep. All as one piece. And I have one other little fun thing, which is that I also look at the world like my mother, when I was growing up, was an artist also, in addition to being a social worker. She's a printmaker, an incredible artist. I'm not a visual artist, but she had this craft that she used to do with us that I love so much. And we would take crayons, and you may have done this. I mean, this is not unusual. And she would have us do all these colors on a piece of paper, and then we would paint India ink on it, and then she would give us a stylus, and we'd scratch after it dried, we'd scratch the ink, and you draw, and the colors would come through, right? So now there are books like that. You can just go to Walgreens and buy like a book that has, colors underneath it with black, and they'll have like, you color in, they already have like the figure, and you can color it in by scratching off the black. So that scratch art is my metaphor for the universe. Like the underlying of everything is all the colors, right? It's the rainbow. We even like biblically have the rainbow, right? If we take all of like what is splashed on the colors in the human world and the physical world, it's like the pain, the separation, like everything that is biological, neurological, any evil, anything that challenges and troubles us as a physical black over the spiritual colors. Then what we can do is scratch that off, right? And let the color shine through. And that's what we do when we connect to others, when we do all of these things, right? When we elevate our purpose, when we take action, we're just scratching it off. So I always love those books, like that you can just buy at Walgreens, because it's just like a nice physical action, and it's like a light attention meditation to sort of follow the lines and let the colors go through. But then when you're done, go outside the lines, right? Like there's colors outside of those lines too. So then it just reminds you that you can transcend your boundaries. And so that's my assignment to everybody. If that assignment, I have one other that I like to give people to do, but go buy a scratch art book and remind yourself of the universe.
And brilliant. And speaking of buying books, can you tell me about your books?
I wish that they were on the market now. So Eli Goes to Heaven will be first, because it's actually like I'm in my final approval of the draft of it, like laying the text out with the pictures with the publisher, with Balboa Press. And so I, it's going to be second quarter of this year that it'll be released. So I don't have a release date, like a published date yet, just because I don't like to declare anything until I have the final book in my hands, but I'm really close. So I will certainly let you know, and would love for you to spread the word to anyone who follows you about when the book is going to be released. The next is Connect Beyond the Internet, which is sums up what I've been discussing here regarding the neurospirituality, the study, and the right parietal, like a lot of that focus in that framework. I've been speaking more, and that's what I've been doing. So I'm pursuing that a little bit more before that book is published, just because a lot of what I do when I speak actually leads to other research. So I feel like I'm maybe 80% to where I want to be in order to publish findings. I'm also reaching out to Harvard and Dr. Michael Ferguson regarding their neurospiritual lab. I'd love to take the research that I've done. I did it as a citizen scientist, and I'd like to have it replicated and done through a university so that there is an actual study. I'm not a university professor, and so I'm looking for a partner to do some of these the spatial spiritual tests, and to see whether or not I can be a little bit more focused on that. I may not wait. I tend to one of my challenges is that I want things to be exactly a certain way before I ship, and I tend to recommend to others, ship. So I may move forward so that I can spread the word a little bit wider, and then maybe there's a second book that has a little bit more of that evidence, but that'll
Or,
be after Eli goes to heaven,
or second edition.
or second edition.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
please do that.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Okay. I will. Thank you for that encouragement.
Well, this I'm pushing it a little too much, but let me ask, why can't that happen before the publication of Eli?
Well, I have a really wonderful and vital life, but it is absolutely too busy. And so if I were consulting somebody, I would say, like, what in the world? I do actually own a music promotion marketing company, and we are very busy. We manage artists, we do radio promotion and streaming campaigns, and I have, like a team of 12, and I have two kids who are in college, and I have a congregation, and I have the book, and I speak on neurospirituality, and I'm writing the book. So in order to really just like function as a human, I'm like, this has to get done, and then this is going to get done, and then this is going to get done, because all this other stuff actually supports my life financially. And so I have to also feed and clothe and do all of that. So mostly it's me juggling a lot of things that are either necessary or exciting.
And that's part of the reason it is important for us to have that right temporal lobe activated, especially during the ages of 7 and 50. Then we're not going to be able to start to let go of it, obviously.
Right.
Yeah. And how has this work impacted how you interact with the music industry? Because I know you travel around a lot managing a lot of these artists, including your own work. Does this impact it at all? Does knowing this information?
Oh, it does, absolutely, which is why I felt really pulled to share it in settings that were business, like business settings, that I help. And how I framed it with the digital fatigue is because those practices have absolutely helped my business. Like it helps the joy that I feel in my business. It helps the success, like the idea that my company is called GrassRoots Promotion. Year. And so all of those concepts were applied kind of naturally. And now in reflection, I look, oh, okay, well, this is why those things work. And now we lean into them, like the idea of, and also what music does. I mean, music has its own neurological functions, like that are actually different. Like we respond to music in a neurological way that is really exciting, but not part of the spirituality framework. But being aware of all of that makes me elevate all of it. Like I lean into it because I'm aware of it. And that's what that was my other challenge to everybody was I have this like Hanani challenge. I say for 40 days, write down every day at the end of the day, get a journal, like one that speaks to you that has something pretty on the cover. And then every single day at the end of the day, write down whatever signs, synchronicities, coincidences, or coincidences that you see. And And even if they're small, right? Like anything that speaks to you, write it down and then do that for 40 days. And what you're going to find is on day one, maybe you're like pushing for one, like what was it? And then on day 30, you have like 10 of them. But like by day 40, you're noticing things all over the place. That's like my Hanani project is like take 40 days, write down the here I ams, write down the signs and synchronicities. Because when you notice something, it's sort of like if I said to you, purple butterfly, and tomorrow you're going to see one somewhere, or in the next few days, you probably will, because I told you purple butterfly. Like your brain's going to be like, there's a purple butterfly, right? And it's going to feed it to you. And it's not going to be magic. It's going to be because it's in there ready to look for. So if there are signs waiting for you and you tell your brain to look for them, the more you tell it, the more they'll find them. And so that's how I feel like these practices have impacted my business. I lean into them because I notice the results of them, and it becomes this sort of cyclical momentum.
Yeah, yeah. And there's so much information being processed through the different aspects of our brains and our
That's
body and our spirit. So we can only ingest, we can only be aware of a certain amount of it. So Purple Butterfly, I'm excited to see you soon.
I
But
love
so I know you have a hard stop that you need to make. So you've already given us gem after gem after gem. But is there any closing gems you'd like to offer? And tell us also how can people get a hold of you? So those two.
Well, a closing gem. Well, actually, wait, I'll say how to get a hold so I can actually close with a gem. So I do have a website that's about to be relaunched. So you can find me right now at rabbinancytunick.com. FlorenceTemple.org is the synagogue where I am the rabbi. And I live stream our services on Friday nights, and we do that on the Facebook page, and then we also do it on a link through the website. And then Rabbi Nancy Tunick at gmail.com, and Tunick is Tunick. Anyone can reach out to me to have direct communication, but the nancytunick.com and rabbinancytunick.com in the next month are going to be relaunched and have an opportunity for a higher opportunity for connection than exists. So yeah, you can find me online. And then, I close every service with a line from our sages that says, "Pray as if it's all up to God, but act as if it's all up to you." And I'd like to close with the idea that spirituality as a foundation for all of your action is what really creates an opportunity to repair the world. So I wish that for everyone who has joined us today.
Oh my gosh. Beautiful. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you. What a fun conversation.
absolutely. All right. Well, we will head out. We'll stop the recording, but we will not stop the blessings of this interview.